Hi, I'm Sally Merrill, and I'm at Forest Home Cemetery, which is one of my favorite places to walk in Milwaukee. They have information on the website about hours and maps of where it is. I have moved here in Milwaukee. I've always liked cemeteries. I didn't grow up here. I moved here as a young adult to start my married and professional life. And once I found Forest Home, it was one of my favorite places to walk. In retirement, I have become a volunteer docent at the Forest Home. Information about docent tours is on the website, and they also have a self-guided tour available on the website. I'm a walker, but I've also seen joggers in here and cyclists. People are welcome. It's a great place to come. Before we get into visiting some of my specific grave sites that we're going to talk about, I want to tell you a little bit about the history of Forest Home Cemetery. The cemetery you see now and the grave sites we visit were part of a cemetery that was founded in 1850. Milwaukee was rapidly developing. It had a cemetery problem. What does that mean? People were dying. This was a frontier. There were no penicillin, antibiotics, and so would haphazard build cemeteries with not much thought as for what was going to happen next year, the year after. So as development occurred, the cemeteries were in the way, and the cemeteries weren't always very well maintained. I will let you figure out what that might mean. So the leaders of St. Paul's Episcopal Church, which is still there on the east side, Lower East Side, came up with a plan, which is to buy this land way outside of Milwaukee and build a cemetery so they wouldn't have to keep moving the cemetery. And we're going to go visit that cemetery. But before I do, I want to talk about the two peoples who buried their dead in this area before any of the settlers came from the east. The first were the Native Americans of the late woodland period. They were known as effigy mound builders, of which there were several in Wisconsin 150, 200 years ago. And they had a mound in Forest Home itself, in the boundaries of Forest Home. There was a significant effigy mound from the mound builder culture. When development came, those mounds largely got flattened and built over. The other peoples to have buried their dead in this area were the Potawatomi. The Potawatomi were the Native Americans that were in Milwaukee area when the settlers came, and they had a main village right at 27th and Forest Home, and they buried their dead in this area too. They were officially removed to Iowa in 1838. Forest Home, from its beginning, has been non-denominational. That means it is not sacred ground in any faith, and from Forest Home's perspective, all are welcome here. And what that meant in early Milwaukee, it was largely Protestants. Catholics had their own cemeteries, Jews had their own cemetery, and some Lutherans would prefer Lutheran cemetery. That's changing, and today it's different. We can go to that part of Milwaukee of the cemetery later. Hi, I'm standing in the northern end of Section 9 by the Newhall House monument. So you can see it's a tall obelisk behind me. The Newhall House fire happened on January 10th, 1883. The Newhall House, when it was built in the 1850s, 7-story wood hotel, was the fancy place to stay in Milwaukee. Abraham Lincoln stayed there when he came to town. But it never really made a lot of money as a hotel, and by the 1880s, its glory days were behind it, and it was a little bit run down. And tragically, a fire broke out like 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock on January 10th. It was a cold, freezing January winter, and the whole hotel burned down. It was the first of the kind of major disasters to hit Milwaukee. It was the first major hotel disaster like this, and it made national news. Over 70 people died, and over 40 of them were unidentified. No one had to deal with this before. They learned a lot in this mass tragedy, which we've seen carried out in things that happened in our lifetimes. The firefighters came quickly, responded with their best equipment. But the firefighters that got there first had ladders that only made it to the 2nd floor. As I said, there were people on the 7th floor. Also, the building was surrounded by telegraph wires that had probably been put in place after anyone thought about fire safety there. So the firefighters had a hard time negotiating their ladders to get up to the building. The taller ladders did show up and get to the 7th floor, and as often with these mass disasters, the first responders are so heroic in their actions. This was true this night. One of the tall ladder of companies that showed up saw that there was a building behind the Newhall House that was not burning, and it went up as high as 7th floor. So they carried their long ladder up to the 7th floor of that building behind the Newhall House, and then put it across the alley and to a room where there were women. There were only women. They were only employees, because that's who was living on the 7th floor. And they had gathered in this one room. They were terrified. They'd been in this room for 10, 15, 20 minutes. Smoke was starting to seep in. So the firefighter had to go over the ladder and bring them each out. He saved lives that way. I talked about what's the monument. Obviously, there's a story behind the monument. What are we going to do with these 40 unidentified bodies? The leaders of Milwaukee approached Forest Home, and Forest Home said, yes, it's a good idea. They donated land, other people donated the money, and they started building this monument with the names of the unidentified dead. As this was getting underway, the leadership of the Catholic community stepped forward and said, we need our own monument because some of the dead are Catholic. And they were unidentified, but they guessed as to who was Catholic by anyone who was wearing a cross when they found the body, and to places where the chambermaids lived, because the chambermaids were all Irish Catholic female immigrants from Ireland. There is a Newhall House monument at Calvary Cemetery also. You may have noticed in Forest Home there's a lot of section markers. That's a good way to get around. I'm standing by the marker for section 24, and we're going to proceed up that hill to visit the next graves on our list. I'm standing near the grave right here at the marker of Increase Lapham, one of my favorite people buried at Forest Home. Increase Lapham came here in about 1836. He was one of the first white settlers coming as Wisconsin was open for development. He is a natural citizen scientist. I think of him kind of like Thomas Jefferson and Lewis and Clark and Benjamin Franklin, Americans who had very little, if any, scientific training, but they had scientific minds. And Increase Lapham was here in Wisconsin with no labs, no really other scientific infrastructure, and he accomplished a lot. I'm going to talk about two things that he accomplished. First was he got off the boat and he immediately started mapping those effigy mounds that I talked about. Because he was here to help develop Milwaukee and Wisconsin, and he knew what was going to happen to those mounds, so he mapped them, and he mapped them, and he mapped them. And he, with the support of the Smithsonian and the American Antiquarian Society, published a book with the mounds in, I think it was like 1852. As a result of that, I learned this when I went to hear a speech on the effigy mounds. The archaeologists in the state of Wisconsin view him as a hero. They have an annual award that they give out every year named the Lapham Award. And they come and visit. And we know he's coming to visit because they leave stones here. Other people visit too. This is what a tradition that started in the Jewish culture is when you visit someone in the cemetery, instead of flowers, you bring a stone. And you'll see that is going here with the Laphams. People are coming to still visit Increase Lapham today. The other amazing thing that Increase Lapham did when he first got off the boat in Milwaukee was he continued his lifelong habit of keeping track of the weather. His brother helped him when he was traveling in Wisconsin. His children, his wife helped him. And he noticed in 1850 that Wisconsin weather comes, I should say in the 1850s, Wisconsin weather comes from the west. And he figured out that if people in Milwaukee knew what the weather was out west, ships would make different decisions about when they could leave the safety of the harbor and go on the journey up Lake Michigan. And he tried to get a National Weather Service put together. It didn't work. What I've learned about people at Forest Home, nothing got done in America in the 1850s because the issue of slavery was just looming in the national politics. But in 1869, there was a terrible storm. I forget how many ships went down in Lake Michigan, and Increase Lapham was ready, and Congressman Payne from Milwaukee introduced the legislation for the National Weather Service, and Ulysses Grant signed it, and I think it was January of the following year. So pretty quickly, they got that weather service in place. One of the things the Weather Service did was get telegraph wires so that in Denver and Iowa and western Wisconsin, they could send telegraph information to Milwaukee and Chicago and points east about what was going on out there so they could predict the weather. Unfortunately for Increase, the bureau closest to his home was set up in Chicago. So his first paid job ever as a scientist was to work for the Weather Service in Chicago, but he didn't, for reasons in his personal life, he didn't stay down there very long, came back to Wisconsin and he died. So thank you, Increase Lapham. This is the marker for 2 of Increase Lapham's children. When you come and see it in person, you'll say, what are these? They look like ferrets, voles, interesting things. They are sheep, and they look odd because they were lamb. But these marker, like a lot of the older ones in Forest Home, are made out of marble, and marble is going to erode and disintegrate in our weather. So the animals are not as beautiful as they probably were when they were first carved. I told you about Milwaukee cemetery problem. Increase Lapham was the one who was hired to survey and lay out the grounds of Forest Home Cemetery. And he picked this site. He bought right when Forest Home opened. He was there to buy this plot for his family and move his 2 children who had died in childhood from downtown, from the cemetery they were, and moved them out here to Forest Home. Right near Increase Lapham, who's back there, is Byron Kilbourn. Byron Kilbourn was one of the 3 acknowledged founders of Milwaukee. He met Byron Kilbourn in Ohio, where Byron Kilbourn and his family made a lot of money developing canals in Ohio. He came here, he decided Milwaukee had a great harbor, that he could help develop a thriving metropolis. He did help do that. He anticipated there would be a lot of canals. The terrain in Milwaukee doesn't look well for canals. You can see how it's rolling here. This is the way Milwaukee looked before development came. Other parts of the cemetery are flatter because they are not the way it was originally, what the settlers found. But Byron Kilbourn, one thing he did was brought Increase Lapham to Milwaukee. Byron Kilbourn, when he realized canals wouldn't be feasible except for the one canal that was built where Commerce Street is now, he went on to railroads where he made a lot of money and he lost a lot of money. He was a trendsetter in many ways, which is he retired to Florida. He was buried in Florida, but historic-minded people in Milwaukee said that's not right, and they have moved his body back here from Jacksonville, Florida. The other 2 founders of Milwaukee, George Walker, he's buried here. Solomon Juneau is not buried here because he's Catholic. I'm now at the grave of Ezekiel Gillespie. We are across the street from Byron Kilbourn and Increase Lapham. Ezekiel Gillespie was born a slave somewhere probably in the western end of Tennessee. We don't know a lot about him. That's not surprising because he was born in slavery. The best records seem to say that his father was the slave owner, his mother the slave. He was able to purchase his freedom and move to Evansville, Indiana, where he had a shop and he had a family. And then around early 1850, he's in Milwaukee with his family. Why did he move? We can only speculate, and here's my speculation, which is the Fugitive Slave Act. That was passed by Congress in 1850, and under the Fugitive Slave Act, all a slave owner had to do was go to a local magistrate near where the slave owner lived and said, this is what the slave looks like, the slave has run away, and people could go out and look for, slave catchers would go out and look for the slave. And that they found in Ohio a man like Ezekiel Gillespie and say, okay, you look like this runaway slave. They'd go to the local judicial system, and the sheriff and the judges got paid more if they found that it was the slave. And Ezekiel Gillespie, if they were accusing him of being a runaway slave, would have no right to defend himself. He would have no right to bring in neighbors and say, but he's been living here for 20 years. So I think that he moved to Milwaukee because Evansville, Indiana is right across the Ohio River from Kentucky, and he did not want to get caught as a slave. He had his shop for many years, in a little shop in Milwaukee for many years. One thing he did of note was to help with the litigation that led for the right of black men to vote in Wisconsin. The Civil War ended in 1865. It took, I think, another 3 years for the amendment to the Constitution that allowed black men to vote across the country. But in Wisconsin, Ezekiel Gillespie tried to vote in November of 1965 at the recommendation of Sherman Booth, a rabid abolitionist, and they turned him down. And you kind of think the fix was in. They knew what they were doing. They appealed. They got to the Wisconsin Supreme Court pretty quickly. And the Wisconsin Supreme Court ruled that black men did have the right to vote in Wisconsin since the adoption of the 1848 Wisconsin Constitution, because of the way that the process for the Constitution. So black men got the right to vote in Wisconsin in 1866, which was one of the first places in America that happened. Another thing Ezekiel Gillespie did was to found the first African Methodist Episcopal Church in Wisconsin. His first wife died. He remarried, and soon after his second wife moved here from Ohio, she and he together asked for the bishop to come from the African Methodist Episcopal Church to help found the church here. He came, they founded the church. It was on the site where the Hyatt is today. There's a historical marker there. And that church is still is still running. I don't know what the road for church. In here in Milwaukee, it is St. Mark's African Methodist Episcopal Church. It's out there on Atkinson. You may have noticed how increased Lapham's tomb marker was kind of falling down. This one is not, because that congregation has given Ezekiel Gillespie a modern marker. It's granite. You can notice different kinds of engraving. The picture of Ezekiel Gillespie is there, and he is still honored today by that congregation. At the other end of section 24, you find this odd to me, artifacts in the cemetery. First, there's an American flag. If you read the fine print here, it says, "Attention, this is a U.S. military cemetery and special rules apply. No walking, jogging, bicycling." So I told you all that was welcome in Forest Home, but in this little area, we should not jog or walk or bicycle. How did this little veterans, cemetery happen? It goes back to the Civil War. The women in Milwaukee early on recognized the need to help take care of the soldiers, and they were building support and helping take care of injured soldiers that returned. The Civil War was seen as the first modern war in a lot of ways, and one of it was the number of massive amounts of dead people, and that not all of them died right away, unlike earlier wars. So the War Department was called in, was put some cemeteries near the big battlefields, Gettysburg, Shiloh. You can go visit those cemeteries. But then some of the injured soldiers would be taken away, hopefully to heal and recover. One of the places that came in big numbers was Milwaukee, because the women in Milwaukee had been early on this project of having a place to help take care of the injured soldiers. So not all the injured soldiers that came here lived. And the ones that died were put here, and then it was an official official War Department cemetery, and it still is. As after the war, things got more formalized, and now there is the veteran cemeteries out there at the VA hospital out there. That's another cool cemetery for those of you who like cemeteries. And Forest Home on their own, if you can look up here, there's another flag, and those are soldiers that were injured and died at the cemetery here, at the hospital here in Wisconsin after the War Department had made its change. So this wasn't officially a War Department cemetery, but these are people from out of town. The nurses don't know what to do, and they say, well, let's go bury them at Forest Home. So they're being honored by Forest Home as though it was official veterans cemetery. I'm standing near the northern end of section 36, which is kind of known as Beer Baron's Alley. Specifically, I'm sitting in front of the cenotaph for Joseph Schlitz. Why did I say cenotaph? Cenotaph is a marker where there's no body. Why is there no body? Joseph Schlitz, unfortunately, had gone back to Germany on a trip, and coming home, his boat sank off the southern coast of England, and his body was never recovered. And in honoring him, his family built this wonderful marker, and they included the ship is carved here. It says lost May 7th, 1875. Hi, we're in a different part of this Forest Home Cemetery. Obviously, it looks different. It looks flat. There's a little bit of explanation for that, which is in the early 1950s, there was a trend in cemeteries nationwide to go for the yard look, that you have this endless expanse of green with no markers interfering with your view. And the markers that are there are flat and flush to the ground. So that's how this part was planned, and I'll talk about how it's being used today. First is, if you look behind me, there's a different theme here, which is colorful grave markers. Forest Home Cemetery is located just off Lincoln Avenue. It's one of the most Latinx part of the city, of the state. And I told you Forest Home was put here because people wanted to, be far away from the city. What's going on today is the neighbors want to be buried in the cemetery in their neighborhood, and often they are Catholic. So for the first time in Forest Home history, there was a consecration on the grounds. A year or two ago, a local Catholic priest came, and there was a service in the chapel, and then they came out here in a procession, and he consecrated this statue of Our Lady of Guadalupe, which is an important statue in the Catholic faith in North America. While we're looking at it that way, you might be able to see an American flag. That's a part of the Forest Home was encouraging veterans and their families to be buried. And if you go out there and look, you will see some plaques to World War I, World War II, Korean War, Vietnam War, Desert Storm, and graves of veterans and their families out that way. I'm standing in the farthest southeastern corner of Forest Home Cemetery in their green burial section called Prairie Rest. We talked about in one of the earlier videos about the lawn approach that in the 50s was popular or what people wanted. Then in the late 70s, 80s, a strong demand for cremations. And now one of the newest trends in burial is the green burial. A cremation doesn't take up a lot of space, but the energy to cremate a body is a fairly large amount of energy. So in green burial, the goal is to have a green burial. So, and it requires a little bit of planning because it has to happen quickly. The undertaker shouldn't be putting in the fluids that often are used for embalming. And then the body goes into the ground in this area, and it will be ashes to ashes, dust to dust, and that body will become part of Forest Home, literally. Family members who want to come in and visit their loved ones or friends at the office can find the GPS location. I think they're even given a GPS device so they can come out here and go exactly to see where the one they're visiting is buried. You'll see I'm standing by the stone. There's some names on here, so they could also come and realize that this is where their parents or grandparents here, and picture them out here. In the August, the prairie part looks a lot better than it does in May when it's cold enough. I still have my scarf on. I am standing in Greenwood Cemetery, which is a separate cemetery on the west corner of Forest Home. The entrance is off Cleveland, and it is a Jewish cemetery. We talked earlier on about the Newhall House fire, how each faith wanted to have respect the rights of their faith for burying their dead, and that was true of the Jews in Milwaukee. And their first cemetery is at 16th and Hopkins. It's still there. It's overgrown and kind of boarded up, but if you look at it, you'll see that there's a sign that'll say, this is being maintained by two of the local synagogues. But I think it was about 1870, I'm not sure about the date, the prosperous German Jews of Milwaukee knew they needed to have a new cemetery, and they chose to have a cemetery near the prosperous Protestants. The prosperous German Jews were the Jews who came and they came with educational skills, and they often achieved a lot of financial success in America, and they were most focused on feeling like they fit in America. And it's not surprising that when they were buried their dead, they wanted to be near the American dead. I should say the American Protestant did. I would focus on one family to show you how this story played out with a family, which is the Friend family. Henry Friend and one of his brothers, he had several brothers. They were all born in Germany. They immigrated to America. They were in the South to begin with, but Henry and one of his brothers came up to Milwaukee and decided to check it out if they could make a home here, and they decided they could, and they started a clothing manufacturer. They started out with just selling men's clothing, but the business grew and grew and grew, and by 1900 it was a significant business in Milwaukee, and a high proportion of the workers were female, and they were making men's clothing and maybe women's clothing too. But Henry Friend and his wife went back to Germany to visit relatives there, and they came back on the Schiller. That's the same ship that Joseph Schlitz was on, and so they also died in the wreck of the Schiller in 1875. An interesting fact that you learn only in cemeteries is the body of Mr. and Mrs. Friend was found. Their bodies are buried here. If you're calling Joseph Schiller, there is no body because they couldn't recover his body. I hope you've enjoyed this video tour of Forest Home Cemetery. Hope to see you out in the cemetery someday. Their website will have events when events are held. Any support of the work here would be welcome and could be given to the Forest Home Historic Preservation Association. And I'm Sally Merrill. It's been fun to be out here in a May morning doing this video tour of Forest Home.